My name is Chris Lukey. I'm the horticulture educator serving Bond, Clinton, Jefferson, Marion, and Washington counties. So I'm in the Southern Illinois area. Our growing zones, we have growing zone 6A and 6B within my county. So as we kind of give that talk, you'll kind of understand that's kind of where I'm coming from on some of the items that you'll see from my own perennial bed or the beds that I'm using a lot of our pictures from, but it can definitely be implied in other growing zones. So what is a perennial? Perennials are small flowering plants that grow and bloom over the spring and summer. They die back every autumn and winter and then return in the spring from their rootstock or other overwintering structure. This is known as an herbaceous perennial. And we know life as a plant parent sometimes can be really rough. We know everyone kind of grows up and matures, and sometimes they spread into other areas that we're not always wanting them to spread into. They can kind of be a little bit of a bully sometimes. And so we need to look for those signs. What's a sign that when your perennials may be being bullied a little bit? It might be, starting to produce smaller blooms. Does it develop a bald spot in the center of their crown? Do they require staking to prevent them from their stems always falling over? Some of these things can be signs that it's time to divide and move someone out. Overcrowding plants compete for nutrients and water, and it's kind of, they restrict airflow. So sometimes that's our biggest issue when we have that restricted airflow that can lead to some diseases. So we have to really watch. And sometimes we're like, oh, it's just so beautiful, I don't want to move it out. But it really is time to kind of think about when should we start dividing. And moving out those plants, that's a benefit. They stimulate larger and more vigorous blooms. Three main reasons that we have to think about dividing our perennials. We want to think about controlling the size of the plants. We can rejuvenate them, keeping them blooming longer. And we also can increase their number. And sometimes this means that we have free or inexpensive plants to share with our friends or other gardeners. And some of this, as you can see, as this bed, it's spaced pretty good, and they're fairly a new bed and it's immature, but as those daylilies and those coneflowers begin to mature, that's going to be a little overwhelming. So that's one good reason to think about this early. So some good guidelines for dividing our perennials. The first thing I would say is you need to think about, did you take a soil test of your new site that you're going into? Do you know of any amendments that need to be made to that site? You could also kind of think about other guidelines. If it's really dry, like it is here in Southern Illinois, you can water daily in advance on that area that's going to be worked if it's really dry. Ideally, plants, you can divide plants when there's a couple of days of showers in the forecast. You can kind of water before then. If it's going to shower, that provides enough moisture for those new transplants. So really timing, if it's really, really dry, maybe it's waiting for that forecast. You can divide perennials on a cloudy, overcast day instead of out in the beating sun. I know sometimes that doesn't work into our schedules, right? We want to do it today because we're off or it's the weekend, but that can really cause your plants to dry out. And we need to think about preparing the area for the new transplant. That's important, right? We want to move them, but we want to be successful. So if we incorporate any of those amendments prior to planting, that's a great way, to set them up for success. We also watch for the sun in that area. Is it getting too much sun? Is the drainage really good? So think about all those things that can really set that new transplant for success. Another thing we want to think about when we're dividing, we need to go ahead and when we hate to cut blooms sometimes, but we really need to prune the stems and foliage to 6 inches from the ground. This will ease, you can actually get that plant, we can see what's going on with that plant. It will also reduce any moisture loss for that plant. So if we trim it back, even though we think, oh my gosh, we're whacking this one back, we really need to do that. And that will kind of help with some of that transition as we move it out. The other thing is we need to think about, we're going to lift that parent plant. So how are we going to do that? So lots of ways we can lift up the parent plant easily is we can use a broad fork or sharp shovel or spade. We like to use sometimes even our broad forks, those to dig down deep, and that way we can get around all those sides without actually tearing up that root structure, and we can kind of pull around. So if we take all 4 sides of the plant around the parent plant, about 4 to 6 inches, and we dig down with our sharp instrument, we then can go all the way around it, and then we can go underneath it, as you kind of see, and we can pry up and pull with the tool. We can lift the whole clump up to be divided. If the plant is huge and heavy, you may need to go ahead and cut it into several pieces and with your shovel. Typically, you're going to see a plant like a grass that's going to have that really large clumpy root structure that's really tough to get under. That one may need to be divided into sections. It may be too large as a parent plant and you have to divide it up. So think about that. What am I going to need prior to starting your digging? Once you get it, you want to gently lift that plant up from the ground and remove any excess dirt or soil around the root structure. We call it dirt, right? Because on the top of it, there might be leaf litter, there might be items that we have. So I'm talking not just the top layer of that litter, I'm really talking around the roots. You may want to pull it apart so you can really see the structure and see what's going on. The next thing we want to think about is we want to think about separating the plant into smaller divisions. And you can do this multiple ways. It depends on what type of plant you're actually dividing. So we want to gently pull the roots apart with your hands. We know a root structure like we have here that has our iris is going to be different than a fleshy root like our peony roots. So we know we may want to leave the soil around it, or we might want to pull it apart so we can really see what's going on. The way you can do that is to shake off any loose soil, remove dead stems and leaves at that time. You're going to trim those back and cut those back. We'll go ahead and detangle some of those root balls that you have so you can really see where you need to make those good divisions. If you find that you have a large clump, you can cut them with a sharp knife or a spade. Those are ways that you can pull them apart and really see what's going on. Put 2 forks, another way you can take and divide if you have to. So a big clumping structure like your grass is, you may have to put 2 forks in the center of the clump and pull it back to back and kind of pull those forks apart and pull it. So there's lots of different ways depending on which item you're going to divide on the method that you're going to use. Another thing that we need to consider is that each division should have 3 to 4 vigorous shoots and a healthy supply of roots with it. Remember the saying, sleep, creep, leap. Perennials are a long-term investment, and they're sometimes slower growers. So that first 2 years, we want to think about, how are they going to grow? And so we want to make sure that we have those healthy root supply and those shoots. If it only has 1 vigorous shoot, we know it's going to take a while for it to mature. So really try to grab those divisions that have those 3 to 5 vigorous shoots. Try to keep these divisions shaded and moist until they're replanted. We just don't want to throw them on the side that might be in the beating sun if possible. We want to trim any broken roots with a sharp knife or pruners. We want to make sure that we're using a 10% bleach solution. This will clean our tools between the plants. So if we're doing multiple cuttings of different plant stock, we want to make sure we clean in between. I know it might take a little bit of time, but it's definitely worth it. And we definitely don't want to transmit any pathogen. Replant divisions. Whenever we're starting to replant those divisions, we want to make sure that we're firm in the soil around the roots to eliminate any air pockets. And we want to water them really well after we plant them. So kind of the keys as we're coming into it, dividing our fall blooming perennials. We're right here now. So these are our fall blooming perennials in the spring. That's the time. So all of these that we're doing, we want to take and wait and do those. Why? So we know new growth is emerging in the spring, and we can divide and see those shoots a lot easier instead of doing them right now. We want to wait and divide those in the spring. Smaller leaves will not suffer as much like transplant shock or wilt damage as we would if we were taking them now as full grown leaves and stems. And we know that, you know, in the springtime, it's usually a lot easier. We have those spring showers that kind of help us out with our watering, and we make sure we get lots of attention to them as they're kind of getting established. Plants divided in spring have an entire growing season then to become established and get those roots to really get growing and get that plant really kick-started. So some of the things that we want to think about with those perennial divides is fleshy roots are best divided in the fall. So those are going to be our spring. So we want to think about what kind of root or what kind of plant we want to divide. So if we go into a fall divided, some of the things that we can kind of divide this fall are our bearded iris every 3 to 5 years, Joe pieweed, we can divide that, salvia, goldenrod every 3 to 5 years, bachelor button. They're best if divided in late summer, fall, from our mid-August temperature range into our October, right before first frost. Around here, it's usually the middle of October. We want to think about we can divide those. Another one that we want to think about is dividing our spring and summer blooming perennials in the fall. It's easy to locate the plants that need to be divided. So in spring, we can kind of see them. They're kind of blooming. We can divide those plants in the fall. Time for it to, we can kind of mark them and say, these are the ones that I want to go ahead and divide. And then we can kind of tag them. That's the easiest way. I like to tag certain colors that I want to divide out and have a little band on them and tag them so we can locate them. And then when we go to divide those plants in the fall, we want to make sure that we have it 4 to 6 weeks before the ground freezes. If it's going to freeze and get, you know, it's one thing to have a frost, right? But if it's going to freeze and the ground's going to be frozen, it's really not a good time to go ahead and plant. We wanted them to become established and get some roots to get established. So we want that before that freeze point. But I like, again, like I said, I like to divide those a spring and summer blooming in the fall, but I want to tag them. So I will tag them with a little label and know which one I have. So we want to divide our perennials every 1 to 2 years. To 3 years max, right? We want to wait. We want them to become established, but we know that we can't divide them too many times. We want to be able to share them. We may be moving and we go, can I divide these? These are all plants that we can divide within that 1 to 3 years range. Typically, I like to get them a couple years to get established, but if you have to move them, these are ones that can really be durable and take a transplanting or division fairly well after blooming that first year. So some of those things that you can divide up every 1 to 3 years is an aster, bee balm, or monarda. We know monarda can get very robust. So dividing those up is a great one to do very quickly within their growing. Coral bells, Shasta daisy, carnations, tick seed or coreopsis, and tall phlox. All of those can be divided fairly quickly. Another one that we want to think about is as they're going into that division, there's some that really want to become established before you kind of cut into them and divide them. So we need to wait to that 3 to 5 year mark. A stilby is one of those. And I will say a stilby, they take a year to become really prolific bloomers. I have some pink and white stilby in a shade tree in front of my house, and I really enjoy them, but I know I need to get them established. And so they're really one that don't like to be divided too soon here in our growing zone. Purple coneflower, black-eyed Susan, daylilies, and we know divisions, we want to have plenty of fans on those. Speedwell and Jacob's ladder. These we want to wait just a little bit longer and make sure that we have mature plants and root systems before they get divisions. Now, some that we really want to get established and give them every chance, they don't like to be divided as well, but you need to really give them plenty of time, and that would be goat's beard, hostas, Siberian iris, meadow rue, oxeye, and lady's mantle. These are ones that we want to think about and let them become really established in larger plant space. Then we start dividing them up. They just do much better as transplants if they have that time to be established. Perennials also have several different types of root systems, and each of those need to be treated a little bit differently. So the first one we're going to talk about is our spreading root systems. These are root systems that can crowd out their own centers. They can usually be pulled apart by hand or cut apart with shears or knives. But we need to divide these plants into clumps of 3 to 5 vigorous shoots into each part if we can. That's the best way for them to really take off as transplants and kind of go. So spreading root systems, they have slender matted roots and they originate from many locations. So some of those include your asters, your Monarda, the bee balm, black-eyed Susan. We know they can really become bullies, so those are easy to make divisions. Lamb's ear, I love it in spring, as soft as it is. Coreopsis, yarrow is one that really we can have multiple divisions and put it out. Bellflower, blanket flower, and coneflowers. So here's one you can kind of see. This is lamb's ear in the center of this photo. There's some columbine on there. There's some irises going. So this one, as you can see, it kind of has spread out and kind of moving around right through the center there. So you can see kind of, it doesn't stay in one little clump. It kind of spreads along, and it's a great one to have, but it's also a great one that you can divide and kind of move out into other areas as a good filler. You can kind of see here, this is more of a sedum, a variegated sedum in the bottom corner. Along with that, you can see that how the lamb's ear is kind of spreading around it and going onto either side of it. This is a great one that you can go ahead and take divisions and add to other locations and feel fine about that division going. As you can kind of see here, this is a butterfly garden that's at a school setting, and you can see how it's kind of getting overpowered by the asters on the far left side. Those are where you could start taking divisions. If it gets too far, what's going to happen is it's going to encroach on the front of that. And it's a beautiful backdrop in this setting, but as they start encroaching in, it's going to smother out some of those other plants that they really want as those spring bloomers. So think about divisions and what you're going to place in that small space as it matures, right? So this is ones that we can go ahead and divide and move out. Again, this is actually one of our, it's actually a green-eyed Susan, right? So it's a black-eyed Susan family, but you can see how robust they can become even as a cultivar. As you're going through, you can see Monarda here, bee balm, you have some Joe Pye. You can see how if it's just a meadow that you're going to put your perennials in, that's fine. But if you have a small limited space, it really can encroach on top of each other, and it can really smother out other elements that you're really wanting to showcase. So our next one we're going to talk about is our clumping root systems, right? So clumping root systems originate from the center clump with multiple growing points. So we need to keep at least one developing eye or bud with each division. If larger plants are wanted, you want to keep several eyes of those. So if we pull them all into little bitty individual things, it's not going to thrive as well as if we keep several eyes together. So some of those that we need to think about, or your astilbes, your hostas, your daylilies. Ornamental grasses is another one, right? We don't pull each blade of grass and each one apart. We know we want to take a clump of that. So clumping root systems are definitely, I would really use sedum as an example. Sedums, it's really great you can kind of see where in the spring where they're starting to become established or coming up, you can kind of see the dead part here, and in the bottom you can see the green new starts that are coming through in that clumping system. And that's easy to be dug up and divided by being able to see those visual cues down here in the bottom. Another great one that you can have a clumping system is your purple coneflowers. You can do those every 4 years. You can, pull those apart and divide them. You can see how mature they get and how they kind of branch out and they kind of overtake. So this is definitely one that you can go ahead and utilize. Here's the daylily. You can kind of see they definitely, they can increase your rootstock. They are definitely a great element to have to your perennial garden. There's so many varieties and there's so many colors and combinations that you can now have. So it's ideally to go ahead and get those divisions that have those nice blades that are kind of getting fans that are getting started. The next one we're going to talk about is going to be our rhizome division. And those we want to think about when we cut and discard our rhizome sections. You'll see, and as we go through, we're going to talk about, you really need to inspect them, right? Because we can have insect damage and we can have disease issues that happen. And then you'll also see some old rhizomes that have those mature that are starting to brown, and all that can be trimmed and treated and discarded if it's if it's too badly damaged. So we want to really look at our divisions when we take them and have a chance to inspect them and pull all that extra soil away. As we're kind of doing this, we're going to watch a video here shortly, but we want to think about stems that are growing horizontally or above the soil level. Most of these, have those shallow roots and they have those anchor systems to them. So we want to make sure that we're getting plenty of space around them before we lift. So we're not breaking things apart quite as we have. And we want to think about replanting them, that we want to kind of mound up our dirt, our soil with the top of it. And we plant them on the top, the rhizome on the top of that mound. We don't want to get that really deep down into our soil area, because what happens with that is that they don't thrive quite as well. So we want to think about not only when we're dividing them, we want to think about how are we going to transplant and replant. So here's a rhizome division. You can kind of see we're lifting this out, and we'll be very careful because we're going to have some that may need to be discarded and the root systems are going to be attached. We're also going to see daughter plants that are going to be coming out, and we want to make sure that we can successfully transplant those. Here's some irises, some different colors that we have established. So I'm going to see if I can go ahead and get this to play for you. This is one of our hort educators, Ken Johnson.
Irises are easy to grow, long-lived, relatively carefree perennials. However, bearded irises like these, and other irises that grow from rhizomes like Siberian and Japanese iris, should be divided every 3 to 5 years when flowering begins to decline or the clumps become crowded. This will help keep the irises blooming, as well as to help prevent issues with any iris borer and soft rot that you may have. They can be divided anytime after flowering, with July and August being the best time to do this. This way the plants will have enough time to establish new roots before winter comes. Here we've got some irises that we've already divided, so let's take a look at how to divide irises and then plant them once we're done. When dividing iris, you want to lift the entire clump with either a shovel or a digging fork. So you're just simply going to stick that into the ground underneath the clump of iris that you have and lift that up from the soil. Once you get that clump up, you want to remove as much of the soil as possible. If you have real heavy soils and it's wet, you may need to use a hose to get as much soil off as you can. You'll also want to cut back the leaves to about 1/3 of their original height. This will make the plants a little bit easier to work with so the leaves aren't hitting you in the face, and it will also help them when you transplant the plants so they won't be losing as much water while they're getting established. This can be done either after you lift the clump or before it, more of a personal preference. Your iris clumps can either be broken apart by hand or you can use a knife or pruning shears. If you're using a knife or pruning shears, you want to disinfect those with a 10% bleach solution or sanitizing wipes in between cuts so you're not spreading any disease that may be present. So you're going to take your clump and you're going to start breaking it apart. The rhizomes that you're going to be transplanting should be firm and light colored. Those indicate that they are healthy. So you can see on this one it's got some dark roots. There's no fan of leaves on here, so this is not a rhizome we'd want to transplant. We'd want to discard this. Here we've got some of the rhizomes that we've divided from our clumps. Right here are some of the rhizomes that we were going to want to keep. So again, these are going to be light colored and firm. They have a nice healthy root system, and again, these roots are light. They have a fan of leaves with at least 4 to 5 leaves on them as well. Here are some other rhizomes. While they do have nice firm rhizomes, they're a little on the small side. They don't have as many leaves as we would like to see on that fan, so they're going to be a little bit smaller, and more than likely you're going to have more than enough rhizomes, so you can probably discard these if you want, or you can plant these, and these are just going to be a little bit delayed in flowering. Here we've got some other rhizomes that we also don't want to keep. So this one has a flowering stalk on it, so this rhizome is done blooming. It's not going to bloom again. You can also see it's got a lot of dead roots on it, so this is something we're going to want to discard. And this rhizome right here, even though it's nice and big and firm, again, it doesn't have any fan of leaves on it, and also the roots on this rhizome are starting to die, so this is also something we're going to want to discard. Here's another example of a rhizome we've dug up that shows what we're trying to do a little bit better. Here you can see we've got this old flower stalk, which again isn't going to flower, and what we're going to do is break off these side rhizomes, and this is what we're going to save to plant. Here we've got a few other examples of some rhizomes we don't want to keep. These are pretty soft. When you're digging these up and dividing them and you stick your thumb in there, you'll definitely know these aren't going to be ones you want to save. They also smell pretty bad as well. So these are, again, aren't rhizomes we're going to discard. Once you have your iris clumps divided, it's time to plant the rhizomes that you're going to keep. To start off with, you want to dig holes about 4 inches deep and place a small mound in the middle of those. This will also be the time if you want to add any amendments to your soil like compost to do that. If you've conducted a soil test and it indicates that you are deficient in anything, this would be a good time to add that stuff as well. So we want to take our rhizomes and place those on top of that mound and have the roots draping off the sides of those down into the soil. Next, we're going to bury our roots in our rhizome slightly. You don't want to bury your rhizome too deeply. You want to leave that slightly exposed because planting too deeply can cause issues with rot. Typically when we're planting irises, we are going to plant them in groups of 3 to 7, often in a kind of a triangular pattern. And we are also typically going to have the fans of leaves all facing the same direction. Once you get your rhizomes planted, you're going to want to water them well to help get them established. Then, come spring, hopefully you will have some iris flowers to enjoy. Thanks for watching, and keep on growing.
So this is one that I'm going to show you. This is what the clump is on our far right side. You're going to want to pull it with the stem. Typically, I have seen people wait until first frost. You will know when you have a frost event, dahlias are very susceptible, and you'll go out there that morning and you go, oh, maybe it was just a light enough frost, it's not going to affect it. And by noon, all of the leaves will turn almost to a black. I mean, they definitely are hit hard by a frost. And so all the foliage will really show the symptoms of having that frost event. And that's the time that you can go ahead, you're going to be done, go ahead and discard and cut back to at least 6 inches on that stem, and then start digging those tubers up. And you can kind of see, I put them out, I remove excess soil at that time and let them, so they're going to have to cure. They need 2 to 3 days to cure. So they're going to need that skin on them. They're going to actually harden off a little bit, and they're going to need a little time to cure off. You can store these 2 ways. I know some like to store them in large clumps in the basement or an area that is protected that's not going to freeze. Some like to go ahead and make divisions and then label them and wrap them and store them. However you prefer, kind of works. I think either end of that. The main thing that you want to think about is definitely, as you're showing here, you want to make sure that you have those eyes that are attached to the tuber. That's going to be a viable tuber. If you have pieces that are broken off, they will not be viable. And so you and I need to go ahead and discard those. But you can see dahlias are a great one to have and to keep. They're definitely worth the extra storage and extra care that's going to be needed for those divisions. But you can see these peaches and cream dahlias are just beautiful. One of my favorites, and we definitely take the time to store it and to make those divisions. Another one is our garden peonies. Those are those fleshy roots. We want to make sure when we're taking divisions that we have buds that have eyes. We want to make sure that we have an eye to that root system. You're going to see they're small, and I'll move ahead here, but we want to make sure that we have a small eye on there so that they're successful. Typically, they're going to say you're going to have 3 to 5 eyes when you're making a planting on your first year. If you have a larger plant, if it has 5 to 10 eyes, you're going to see larger blooms and longer blooms during those 5 to 10 eye divisions. Typically, if you have an older plant that's maybe 10 to 15 years old, you're going to see anywhere from 15 to 20 eyes on some of those root divisions as you're going up to divide out. But typically, a first-year planting, you're going to see a 3 to 5 eye as your division that you're going to plant. And why we want to plant maybe multiple eyes in our division is because it can take 3 to 4 years before you're actually going to have enough of a plant to have those stems that you can harvest. They really want you to cut back and increase your foliage the first 3 years. And then your 4th year, you actually can start harvesting those beautiful blooms. It's really either you keep them on, some will just leave them on the plant, but you really don't want to harvest hard those first 3 years because you're really wanting that root structure to really develop and to send out and to have those eyes developing so you have more blooms. Another one we want to talk about that everyone loves ornamental grasses. I do too. They're a beast, though, sometimes when you're wanting to divide those large, tough roots. These are ones that you start to see maybe some dying in the centers of them when they get very massive. They might be a little going awry. They might be spreading out into your lawn. And so you really want to kind of tame them down and get them more manageable. These really need to have that method where you take the 2 forks in there, or you go in and you pull apart, or you actually take your shovel and make large strikes and divide them. They're very vigorous, so you're going to have to divide with a shovel or a sharp instrument to get through those root structure. Depending on their age. If they are fairly young, 2 years, 3 years old, they may not have that mass as maybe a 10-year-old grass that's just taken over and become fully established. So just think about that density layer, and if you're going to need to have help dividing it, it may be where you bring in a friend and another gardener that helps you divide, and then you each have some divisions that you can restart and plant. In the spring, sometimes it's a little easier than late fall. Like now it's really dry. Divisions are going to be harder to take. Spring is probably an easier time to go ahead and make those divisions. Lots of different grasses don't tolerate a fall division, right? Because they're so established and it's getting dry, they won't tolerate it. So you really want to think about what's the best approach to use when you're going with those grasses. And some perennials just really, either due to having a taproot system that has that long taproot, that they really prefer to be divided due to, you can make transplants with seeds, or sometimes they just really, they get those structures and those root systems going, and they're not really great to transplant. Once they become established, you're going to have less success rate with them. Doesn't mean it won't always happen. You can move some stuff, but I definitely would say Asclepias, your milkweeds, are definitely one that you should avoid trying to transplant them. I know it seems like, oh, they're beautiful and they'll just pop right out. You really should try to get them and do divisions by seed, by reseeding them, or starting divisions as they're very, very small, because as that taproot becomes established and you cut it, they're just not going to thrive. Another one that really you should avoid trying to divide perennials would be some of your euphorbias, ornamental poppies, lavender. You can take smaller divisions of that, but once they get it really established, or another one that can be very fickle to go ahead and transplant. False indigo, yuccas, columbines, Lenten roses. They're difficult to move sometimes if they're over 5 years old. So sometimes it's introducing or collecting seed might be making some cutting divisions might be a better way than to actually move the parent plant. Again, this is a milkweed, common milkweed that you definitely want to be able to harvest. And sometimes they go to seed and it's easier to harvest that way. Fall is a great time to collect. You'll see the seed pods. This is the time of year we're seeing a lot of the seed pods that are starting to burst and open. So we're seeing that happening. The other thing is we also want to think about when we're doing our perennials, aftercare, right? We need to think about what zone am I moving it to. For me, locally, I would be in our later zones, our 5B or 6A, 6B, maybe a later in Southern Illinois, 7A, or we're moving up to Central Illinois, a 5B. We need to think about, if I'm sharing a transplant or I'm sharing with another gardener, how much can they tolerate, that if they can only tolerate, getting down to less than freezing, they may not take a -10 degree, and you may not be able to actually have them thrive and be helpful and starting healthy and getting going. And you're going, oh, I'm going to give you all these plants, and then they don't thrive, or they die the first winter. So really think about where you're transplanting from, if they'll tolerate those cold conditions, because some plants just won't tolerate it as well as others. Another one we want to think about is we can use mulch as a weed suppression. We can kind of control the moisture. We can keep some extra moisture there. But we also want to think about that we don't over mulch, right? We don't want it to be a mulch volcano, and we want to have plenty of space around that crown of that plant. We don't want to go, oh, I don't want to weed all spring, and so I'm just going to mulch it real heavy because that's going to be detrimental to those new transplants. The other thing is we sometimes don't think about is if we're moving those transplants, we really need to water, because watering is very important. The rule of thumb is 1 inch of water per week for those established plants, but those transplants aren't going to be established, right? So they may need a little more care and a little more testing of that soil to make sure they're getting plenty of moisture. A soaker hose sometimes can be a way that you can do that. And everyone kind of asks, that's usually whenever you're doing your perennial transplants, should I fertilize my new plants? Some will tell you need to wait to fertilize those new plants to give them time to grow a little bit. I would definitely say refer to your soil test. That's why we asked you if you had done a soil test in the beginning of this presentation. I want to know, does it need that amendment? So it may or it may not, right? So that's the way for you to really go. We don't want to get them growing and over fertilized if you're planting them in the fall going into winter, because we don't want that new growth to become damaged due to winter injury or anything. So think about your amendment. Your soil test is very important. And then we know, everybody has a little bit of that education where we have to learn how to divide our larger units into smaller sections. Sometimes we have to think, do I want to take the center out? Do I want to take side shoots? Everyone's bed design is a little different. So your division may be looking different than another gardener just because you want to pull from different areas, or it's starting to encroach. Like you've seen the lamb's ear was encroaching around my sedum. So I'm going to take those sides off, where someone would say, oh no, just take one part of it off or something like that. So remember, you're going to have to learn what works well for your design and what you want to do, or if you want to share that piece with someone else, it may not be that you want to re-add it somewhere. So we have to learn a little bit of what works for you in your growing zone. The other thing is you want to think about when should everybody be divided. Is it spring or is it fall? And that's how you're going to be most successful. Some tips that I have is, some of them, sometimes we get, and it gets too late into the winter time and we think, oh, we can't make divisions. Tag those and label those plants. And, it might be that it wasn't a good time that you're going to go into spring. If you want to know a certain color, I really recommend labeling plants, even if it's in wintertime and you really think about it and you have some time, you go, oh, I know where that plant's at. I want to go ahead and label it. It's never too late to label, and make sure your labels are out there so you know what you have. And then here are some good resources to use and guides on dividing perennials. If you have questions, and I know we always do, there's a great YouTube video that you can watch on Ken Johnson. There's lots of informational fact sheets on certain species and varieties that you want to go ahead and divide. So make sure that you look in that prior to making your division. I had to share, this is Norman, our little Jersey bull calf, and he comes out into the garden and likes to visit too. So you got to remember that you're having fun with this too. As you're adding, you remember you're going to have lots of visitors to your garden. It may not be Norman visiting your garden, but you definitely want to think about who's coming and what the design looks like at your own garden. And we want to remind you that 4 Seasons Garden Webinar Series is on YouTube. You can go there and check out past recordings. And I ask that you let me know if this was helpful and take this brief survey about dividing perennials. We'll leave this up, and